based on how the last few weeks have gone, this class will probably also end early. We're getting to that point in the semester where people are dropping and not showing, and those of us who are here, I think, are tired. So instead of forcing you all to sit here and not get too much, I'd rather cram more information to a shorter period of time. So what that means practically is that we're just going to be covering one topic today. I will be emailing everyone about what we're going to be talking about next time. It's probably going to be about things like, it's going to be interacting with some of these things that we've been talking about in terms of individual, it'll interact with some of the community stuff, but it's also going to look at like, what is it to be a person and whether technology is changing that. So we'll look at like some extreme artificial intelligence, some sci-fi type stuff. So hopefully it'll be a bit interesting of a discussion next time. But today, and there won't be much reading, so don't worry about that, but it's going to be just a couple things here and there. But for this time, we're going to be talking about democracy. So and specifically the impact or interaction between democracy and technology. So first off, what's democracy? It's a word that gets thrown around a lot. It's a term that you hear on the news constantly, you hear discussed every day. What is democracy? Let's actually like take the time to step back and define something which most of us just take for granted. What is democracy or a democracy? Anybody? I know you've all, how many of you have heard this word before? I hope you have.
Professor, like in general, it's just a system of, how would I say, a system of government, I guess.
And what type of government? What sets democracy apart? It's a key with people having a say. So it's a government in which, yeah, it's a government by the people. Demos was people in Greek. So it's a government style in which everybody gets a say, at least in theory, on how the government works. So what are some other, just to contrast it, what are some other types of governments that exist that are not democracies? Anyone know? You can either give the name, yeah, a communist country is not a democracy. Communism, where a communist country in the strict sense is just, there's no leadership in an extreme case where everybody is equal and there's no voting systems. It's more just somebody is placed in power and then they stay in power and there's not the usual sort of thing. What other are the things we're used to? What are some other types? Let's see if I can draw one of these. Yeah, monarchy. A monarchy, a king or a queen. Another one would be a dictatorship. Another one is an oligarchy. Anyone know what an oligarchy is? So a totalitarian dictatorship is complete power, total power by one person. An oligarchy is a rule by a small number of people. So if you had like a council of like all the people who, and a lot of times in history we've had this, like the richest 10 people in the country or the 10 priests, the 10 most powerful priests would rule, that would be an oligarchy. So yeah, that's what we mean by a democracy. Now, here's a question we don't ask all that often, which is the following. Why is democracy good? What is it about democracy that makes it good? We more or less in this culture or in this country accept as a matter of fact that democracy is a good thing. We've talked when democracy spreads around the world that it's a good thing. And I'm not disputing that. I don't want to say that democracy is not a good thing. And I think in a lot of ways it is a good thing. And in fact, it's the, as I can't remember who, it's the best of all the bad governmental systems in a lot of ways. But why? What is it about democracy that makes it good? So more freedom. What do we mean here by freedom? What is it to have freedom in this sort of sense? People are heard. get a say. So these protects the rights of citizens, protects rights of citizens. So these are the things we've written down. So one, more freedom. What does this mean in this context? What does it mean to have freedom in a democratic society? And this is, again, like, this is something where we all agree. I'm not disagreeing with this. I just want to make us think about things which we often take for granted. What is this freedom we're speaking of? What do we have freedom to do in a democracy that we might not in someplace else? So there is a freedom to vote element. But yeah, freedom of speech is a really big one. And so what does this mean, freedom of speech? Basically, you're allowed to say things without worrying about getting punished, because in a monarchy, or especially in a totalitarian dictatorship where one group is in power, it's generally the case that if you speak against that one group, because they have all the power, if you speak against them, you end up getting silenced aggressively by the government. Also, people are heard and people get a say, or people get to vote. What is good about this? Well, think about what a monarchy, how a monarchy works, or a totalitarian dictatorship. What decides in a dictatorship? What makes the decisions as to what happens next?
Use the people like the head person, and maybe just like the small group that advise him. That's it.
Yeah, the dictator, and then the small group of people who influence the dictator. Or in the case of a monarchy, the king or queen and whoever works with that king or queen. And I'm talking about an absolute monarchy, not the whatever we want to call the British monarchy today, which really isn't a monarchy. You just stick a crown on an old person and send them out on parades. That's a different type of monarchy. I'm talking about the ones where the king or queen actually has power. And so the thing about those sorts of monarchy, that sort of government, is that everything depends on that one person, and you really have no direct way of influencing their decisions. You have no direct way of doing things for your well-being. So in a democracy, if the king or queen decides to kill everybody, outside of starting a large war, which is very difficult when the king or queen has the army in charge, there's really very little to protect yourself. In a democracy, at the very least, you have some way of connecting with the people who you vote for, the people that you work with, or the people who work in Congress on your behalf. You have a say in what happens. So at least in theory, you have more control over how the country operates and how it affects you. In a monarchy, if you don't like what the king is doing, outside of killing the king, there's nothing you can do. In a democracy, you can petition your government. You can vote for different people. All of this is the general idea of why we like democracy. It gives people a say in things, at least in theory. Now, something that gets discussed less is democracy is not perfect. One, it can go wrong, and two, it also has certain sorts of flaws or weaknesses in it compared to other government systems. And I want to highlight these because what we find with democracy is, in the modern world where technology is changing things, there are certain elements of democracy that are put under extra strain by this new type of technology. And what we're finding is a lot of the things that used to be not as big problems with democracy are causing our democracy to operate in a less effective way than it used to. So with democracy, let's discuss, there are two ways to approach this. One, we can just talk about things about democracy that are inherent weaknesses of it, or things about democracy that are not, these are the things where other governmental systems actually operate better. And then what we can also do is talk about the democracy, let's put weaknesses. And then also we have things that can go wrong. So some of these things are just inherent problems with democracy that hold for all democracies, despite all their benefits. And the others are the things that can go wrong that prevent a democracy from doing what it's supposed to do well. So even the best democracy has weaknesses, but then also there are things that can go wrong that turn a good democracy into a less good one. So what are some of either the things that can go wrong or the inherent weaknesses of democracy? Jorge.
Yeah, Professor, I was gonna say, it's not like a new system just comes out of the air like this. That's why I think democracy inherit things from past systems. Like you were talking about oligarchy, and we could make an argument that still very powerful people get like a have more power than a regular person, like a citizen, a regular person with not, I'm trying to say.
So I think that that's a really good point. So this is in an ideal democracy, a perfect democracy, the way we think of it, in like the way you get taught in grade school. How many votes does everyone in the United States get?
One per person.
1 vote per person, which means in theory, who has the most say on who gets elected? Is there any one person in particular who has more of a say than anyone else?
No,
In
not
theory. In theory, no. In theory, for a good democracy and a perfect democracy, everyone gets a say that is equal. Everyone has the ability to control the government to the exact same degree. However, as a matter of fact, is that what we see? No, it is not. And why? Because of some of the things we talked about in earlier classes. Money still affects things in government. How? Why is it the case that even if a wealthy person and a poor person have the exact same number of votes, there's still a sense in which the extremely wealthy person can have more of an effect on the country?
Professor, because you maybe can bank candidates that support your positions.
Yeah. So here's one of the major weaknesses in a democracy. Inherent in the democracy is people need to campaign. So in a monarchy, things can go very, very wrong if your government is, if your head of state is terrible, if your person is crazy, things go horribly wrong. But one benefit of a monarchy is if you get a good king or queen, which in most cases is not the case, what they do once they get in power, in theory, is they can spend all of their energy governing. They don't have to spend time campaigning. Now, in a democracy, think about your politicians. Within the first week of getting elected to an office, there's already thoughts about what is my next office going to be. Trump was already out on the campaign trail as soon as he was put into office in 2017. Biden is already thinking about, is he going to run for a second term? So when you're running for another term, that means a lot of your mental energy is going into what it is that you're going to need to do to get reelected or to continue. And what's the weakness of this? Well, campaigning is not free. When you're campaigning for office, what do you need to do? Where does the money go? So you hear that campaigns are constantly fundraising. What is the money being used for? Anyone know?
For the re-election, for the campaign itself, right, Professor?
Yeah, so what sorts of things does that entail? What sorts of things are involved in running a campaign? Advertising is a big one. You need to spend money because, as a matter of fact, if no one has heard of you, they're not going to vote for you. So you need to spend money on advertising. So any sort of that is very expensive. What else? And this is a lot of the stuff that you don't really think about with democracy. We just think, yeah, press conferences. You need to pay speechwriters. You need to pay travel costs. You need to do all of these sorts of things. So generally speaking, it's not always the case, and it's becoming less the case in the modern world, which is something we'll talk about later. But generally speaking, the campaign that gets more money is the campaign that wins. Generally speaking, that's the case. Not always, but very often, if you want to see which candidate is going to win an election, see who has more money behind them. Why? Well, because the more money you get, you can organize more rallies, you can do more press conferences, you can get your face out there, and you can get more people talking about you. And once you do that, it's easier to win. So because of this, how does that end up affecting a democracy? How is it, if the whole thing depends on campaigning, how does that affect the operation of the country itself? How does these sorts of things, you might say, oh, that's just going to affect the campaigning. That doesn't really matter once they're in office, but it does. And why and how? What is the mechanism by which money is able to influence not just the campaigning, but then the legislation that gets passed in a country?
Yeah, Professor, I was gonna say also, like the people that have money, it could appear that they pick who gets to even run, you know?
Yes. So here's what is lobbying. It's something that happens all the time in a democratic government. And you may have heard this term, but what actually is it? What does it involve? How many of you have heard the term lobbying or a lobbyist?
Yeah, I have, Professor. What I've read is that when you lobby for your cause, is you put resources and money into that candidate to sway them to your position or to your plans.
Yeah, so generally what it is these are groups of people who offer to give candidates money for their campaign in exchange for agreeing with them on certain points. So for instance, to take a case, say a bank will agree to offer, or maybe the CEO of a bank will offer a certain candidate. They'll meet with them and say, hey, candidate, we will offer you X many millions of dollars, but we want you to know that we value you as a candidate in part because we think you are going to give us assistance. Or a classic case is the NRA, the National Rifle Association. They give millions of dollars to candidates with the expectation being, we believe that you are going to protect our gun rights. Therefore, in exchange, it's never quite said like you give us this money and we won't do this. But the idea is something like, look, we put you in, we are giving you money to campaign on the expectation that you, while in office, will do things to protect our interests. We as the NRA want to allow people to keep guns and not institute gun control. Therefore, if you get in office and you start instituting gun control, you can expect that money to disappear on your next campaign. It's not going to be there, and you're going to have a harder time getting reelected. So the idea is that what lobbyists are able to do with large amounts of money is actually directly influence what legislation happens, not by getting in there and changing who they vote for, but by influencing the views of the people who are doing the votes by influencing the campaigning.
Professor,
Jorge, you were going to say something.
I was going to say, also when because they assess their efforts, also these lobbying firms are the companies they represent, Professor, then they see that makes sense to invest. This is an investment because what they get in return often is a lot more than what they put in to campaign.
That's exactly right. You can think of what lobbyists basically are is investors in politics. So what they do is they are literally in the same way that if you, how many of you have watched Shark Tank? Anybody watched Shark Tank or any of those other like venture capital shows? The basic idea is if you are a very wealthy person, you might spend some money and put it into a company, invest in it to help them get off the ground, and then in the future, you will get a percentage of that. You buy a percentage of the company in exchange for cash. They use that cash to make the company better, but then you benefit because you are now the owner of the company which has made it bigger, part owner of it. So this is how lobbying works. Lobbyists basically invest in political candidates with the downstream effects going to be that they make money because the candidates push through legislation that benefits them. So things like fossil fuel companies, if ExxonMobil invests in a certain candidate, the expectation is you aren't going to try to make the country greener because that will affect our profits. So here's a way in which, even though the CEO of a large company or somebody involved, the board of governors of a large company, or of an organization like the NRA or a fossil fuel company, all of these people get one vote the same as you. However, they in some ways have much more control than you do because they can spend their money to influence the politicians directly. And when this happens, what you find is it's no longer that everyone has as much of a say or an equal say. A democracy works well when everyone has an equal say. But the very nature of lobbying and everything else means that not everyone can have an equal say. So that's one way in which a democracy can go wrong. What are some other weaknesses or ways in which it can go wrong? Anyone have any ideas? This is one I talked about earlier in the semester, but within the United States, there are organizations that are not democratic, and even governmental organizations that are not democratic. Can anyone think of an organization within the United States government that is not democratic in any way, but is rather authoritarian, or you can almost think of it as a dictatorship in a certain way? It's not quite that, well, yeah, it's not quite that strong, but there is a very, very clear set of one person's in charge, and nobody at the bottom gets any say in what the person at the top decides.
Professor, maybe what I'm thinking is like I read about the Pentagon, how they get funded, but they don't have to tell you how they spend that money. Maybe that could be something.
So Pentagon is one, and you're along the right track. So the Pentagon is definitely a bit less democratic than other things, but at the very least, the head of the Department of Defense and everything like that is chosen by a president who is elected. But there are other cases in which, yes, the person in charge is in some way put in position. And the Department of Defense is very closely related with this. But you can think, what is another area, or what does the Department of Defense deal with? What part of the US government, in a certain sense, is controlled by the Department of Defense? Military, yeah, the military. Think about a military, think about the army. When you're in the army, imagine you're in a war zone. Your commander tells you, we're going here. Is it acceptable for the soldiers to raise their hands and say, you know, we're going to outvote you. There's 10 of us. There's one of you. We don't want to go there. We want to stay right here.
No way, Professor.
No, that's not how the army works. The army is in some sense, a dictatorship, or it's very authoritarian. The person in charge decides. Why is the military like that? Why doesn't the military operate as a democracy? What is it about the nature of war that makes it necessary to have this top-down, very strong, clear chain of command? Same with a police force. What is it about these areas that are necessary that you need this top-down structure? Well, think about it this way. How many of you have been in a group project setting?
Yeah, I have, Professor.
Yeah. How many of you had to write a paper or do a group project together? How everyone should be paying, this should sound familiar to everybody. Okay. In that context, how long did it take you as a group to decide who was doing what? Yeah, it took a while. It takes a long time. You need to talk about it when you're on your own and you just need to make a decision on what prompt you're going to write on. You can do it, if necessary, pretty quickly. So why is it that the military does things in this somebody makes a decision and everyone else jumps to it sort of way? What is the key in the army? What is the key in battle? What can you not lose? What can you not afford to waste?
Oh, time, Professor.
Time. You cannot afford to waste time. A democracy is slow. It's incredibly slow as far as governments go. Something like a monarchy can happen very, very quickly. So in a monarchy, if the king decides to change the laws, they can be changed very quickly. Their mind changes, the laws change. In a democracy, things take a very, very long time. And this means that democracies are in some ways much slower to act and much slower to respond to crises than other types of governments. And this is one of the inherent weaknesses, or if you want to say on the flip side, the inherent strengths. A dictatorship or a monarchy is much more likely to jump into something stupid very quickly. A democracy has these checks and balances in place that will keep the government from driving off a cliff very quickly. But the downside is sometimes you need to respond to issues very, very quickly. And a democracy is not really able to do that. A democracy cannot change direction at the speed that another organization or another type of government can. There's a reason that companies are generally not democratic entirely, and there's generally a CEO who decides the general direction, and then everyone else falls in line, because in business, time is money. Therefore, the downside to everyone getting a say is that stuff takes much longer to get done, which can have some consequences in other sorts of areas. Now, what are some other issues that come up, or other ways in which democracies can go wrong? It's not just that the money still has effects, so it's really not the case that one vote for everyone. What else is possible? Or how else can things go wrong? Well, here's the difference. How many of you voted last time if you're a citizen? So riots are definitely something that can happen. So yeah, it's not going to be complete peace and order, but that's really something that happens in every government. So that's not a special issue with a democracy. What are the special ways in which the role of a democracy can go wrong? Well, actually, riots might be a good case, because what it shows is that voting at the end of the day can be overpowered by other things.
Professor, I was going to say also, like if you look at the history of the country, there are many laws that are put into place that might be oppressive,
Yeah.
but they come up into a democratic system, you know, but they get voted in, like voter ID laws, things that we think are oppressive now.
This is what's often said, the tyranny of the majority. What is tyranny? Well, it's control or oppressive control. And one thing in a democracy is, because it's a matter of voting, it's very easy to end up with the same sorts of oppressive situations as in a non-democracy. So for instance, how did Hitler come to power in Germany? Does anyone know how he got his first office? Did he lead a military coup? Did he kill someone and put himself on the throne?
He was voted in, right, Professor?
He was voted in. Hitler's first position as chancellor, he was voted in the same way that we would vote in the president. It was an elected position. Why was he able to get elected? Well, because in times of crisis, people are willing to accept extreme positions for what they conceive to be the greater good. So just because there are checks and balances in place doesn't prevent someone from being a demagogue, doesn't prevent someone from taking power, because they're able to manipulate or get a lot of people to vote for them and put them into a position where they now have more of a say than ideally we, looking back, would want them to have. And this is another issue with democracy, or a potential weakness, is for democracy to work, the voters are the ones deciding who gets in charge. So if you want a democracy to work well, what do you need the voters to be like? What do the voters have to do when they're making their decisions about candidates?
Just to be informed,
Yeah.
about the people they're voting for?
Yeah. In voters. So for instance, in the United States, we need, and this is going to lead into Howard's next point, which is we need them to agree on something. And so I'll get to that in one point. In the United States, you cannot vote until what age?
18, Professor.
18. Most other countries, it's also 18. Why don't we let 4-year-olds vote?
They're considered, you said 14, Professor?
I said 4. Why aren't 4-year-olds allowed to vote?
Because they're not mature or they're not considered adults.
Yeah. And what's bad? Why is it that we only want adults voting? What can a 4-year-old not do? All right, all of you who are not engaged, let's imagine that there were 4-year-olds. Your 4-year-old child or your 4-year-old niece or nephew decided they wanted to vote. What would be the problem of letting them do this? One, they don't pay taxes. So in some sense, they aren't as invested. But the really important thing, they don't understand what the hell is going on in the world to make decisions. A 4-year-old doesn't understand taxes. They don't understand what sorts of things you should consider for a candidate. They're still trying to figure out what the colors are, or what the difference is between a circle and a square. How are you supposed to choose whether you want a candidate who's going to send us to war with Iran if you don't even understand what a square is? So this is the idea. The reason we don't allow children to vote is we need our voters to be informed and educated. However, one of the issues here is that it's becoming more and more difficult to become educated. And also, people, as a matter of fact, do not always vote in ways that are intelligent. People are very easily manipulated. Just think about how many of us, myself included, have bought something online that arrived and then we're like, why the hell did I buy this? And then you think back and it's like, oh yeah, I was in a bad mood and felt like feeling better, so I just bought the first thing that popped up. Jorge.
Yeah, Professor, I just had a thought, like, this is where the campaign comes in, because sometimes the only information you get is from the candidate themselves.
Yeah, and here's a real issue, which is for a democracy to work well, you need informed voters. But it is very easy for voters to not be informed and to instead be swayed by things like racism or homophobia or xenophobia. These are the ways in which you can get people to vote for you for reasons other than they're actually doing something to help you. And a democracy only really works, it's only useful when you have everyone voting in ways that make sense and actually are going to lead to the benefit of the country. Otherwise, what can happen is you can get these lobbyists to really make the decisions, and then people are only have as much say over these sorts of things as they have the knowledge to understand. So for instance, if you don't understand the complexities of tax systems, then it's very easy to convince you that one candidate is going to make your life harder, when really in truth, it's not going to change anything because it wasn't explained to you in the right way. And so that's another issue, is there's a weakness in the voters. Because if you don't have the necessary knowledge, you can't make these decisions. And now even more than this, another weakness within the voters is something that Howard said, which is that in order to agree to have a cultural society work together to choose the best candidate, there needs to be agreement on what matters, or even what sorts of things would be good or bad, or even something like what the world out there is like. So for instance, if half the country believes that there's this imaginary place that is threatening us, and the other half doesn't, then how are they going to agree on whether we should go to war with this place? One side's going to be saying it doesn't exist, we have nothing to worry about. The other side is going to say it's coming for us. And because there's no agreement even on what the facts are, it's very difficult for the voters to come to any sort of agreement on this, which just means that the lobbyists and the money are able to make bigger decisions on how the country works. So another issue with democracy is it's in some ways less prone to human error, because you don't have the chance of one terrible, terrible person leading things totally astray. But it's still prone to bias and lack of understanding. So just because everyone is voting doesn't mean we're all choosing the intelligent thing. You get enough people together, 1,000 people with the same dumb opinion is still going to be just as problematic as one dumb person with that dumb opinion, if those 1,000 people have the power to control what happens. So that's really the basic ideas. All right, so these are the sorts of issues that can come up with democracies. And in an ideal democracy, it would be the case that we did what was the best for everybody, and we were all very well educated, and we very well understood the views that were being discussed, and we chose a candidate based on a shared knowledge base of what is best for ourselves, what is best for the country, and what each candidate is going to provide us. So that's, of course, an ideal that we don't reach. Now the question is, well, this has just been the democracy side of democracy and technology. What I want to do now is discuss what are the ways in which modern technology has both, one, protected democracy from these weaknesses and prevented things from going wrong. But then one on the flip side are the ways in which modern technology has led to more things going wrong and led to democracy's weaknesses becoming even weaker. And why it's the case that certain elements of democracy are running into problems that they didn't used to run into, and in large part because of modern technology. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to erase this, and I want everyone to spend 5 minutes thinking about one way in which modern technology has changed our government or has influenced our democratic society. And when I come back, I'm going to run to the bathroom, and then I'm going to stand here and make sure everyone is spending these minutes. I want everyone to either say or type in the chat, what is one way in which democracy has been changed by modern technology, either for good, bad, or neutral. So we're going to do what we did the other time. So we're going to do neutral, bad, and good. So spend the next 5 minutes. You can talk amongst yourself in the chat, but spend the next 5 minutes coming up with one way in which modern technology has influenced or changed either the working of democracy or our way of interacting with democracy. All right, and when I come back in a minute and then stand here for 4, I'm going to want everybody to have an answer for me. So take the next 5 minutes, come up with one thing that has been changed by democracy or by technology in the world of democracy, or one way in which technology has changed the nature of democracy. It can be a particular example. It can be a general sort of thing. Just think up one thing and be prepared to share it. What else? What's just, anyone got any just straight neutral things? I'm going to put up just, we now often vote using machines. Can donate to candidates online. Anyone else have one that they want to put up here? Anyone who hasn't spoken yet? All right, so let's just work through these and then we can talk about more issues, because I think these are big ones on the negative side, and especially the ways in which these have downstream effects. But also these ones over here, the good things are genuinely good and genuine improvements. So how has technology changed the way we talk to politicians? Well, you can now talk to politicians directly, reaching out to them on Twitter. Also, politicians can do things like, there are politicians who do things like Reddit AMAs, and there are politicians who reach out and do video conferences, allowing people to talk with their candidates like never before. Why is this good? Why do we want politicians to interact with people in these ways? Well, the obvious answer is that lobbyists were always able, because they had money, they could go and talk to the politicians. Nor's Tech List. So because we couldn't interact directly with our politicians before, the only voices they heard, or the only voices that got through to them, were the people with the money to go and interact with their politicians. Now we can directly interact in a much, more direct way. Politicians can, if they want, more directly interact with their constituents. Jorge.
Yeah, I was going to say, oftentimes politicians, they create this personal relationships with lobbies, but now they have a chance, I guess, to get closer to the community.
Yeah, and this is definitely something, and along these lines, it's also, and this has been especially important with minority voices. People who have been disadvantaged historically found it much harder to get their issues discussed with politicians. It's not as I said last time, it is not a coincidence that things like the Black Lives Matter movement were able to start since modern technology. Things like Twitter, things like Facebook have come into existence. These groups were able to interact with each other for the first time nationwide because of modern technology. They were able to have their voices heard in a way because these concerns have been around for a long time, but when all news was filtered through major news networks, these concerns didn't really make it on there. Now that people get their news in other ways, these concerns, these voices are able to be heard. Groups can organize. That's another good, is grassroots organization. By grassroots, I mean people on the ground. You don't need a giant organization at the beginning to gather and have your voice heard. It can start in a small community and snowball from there through Facebook, through these other things. It's much easier to get money for your organization now because of online. You get a good online presence and people can start donating you money. Also, educates voters. How does modern technology allow voters to be more educated? What is the way in which this happens? Or what do people have access to now that they didn't before? And how do they get the access? And this is like a really straightforward, I'm asking a really flat-footed, simple question. Well, how do we get this information that we didn't have before?
You can Google somebody's profile or...
Exactly. We now have Google. Google puts at our fingertips everything we can want to know about a candidate. Another thing that this allows us to do is we are able to more easily hold candidates accountable for past. So for instance, we're able to find videos of these candidates behaving in other ways. There's a reason that so many politicians are getting in trouble now for sexual misconduct. Why? Well, this is the first time in history that we're able to get this information because it's the first time that there are videos of these things. People can come out with their stories. So we're able to hold our candidates accountable in a way like never before. We're also able to educate ourselves both about them and what their positions are, and also about the issues themselves. If you want to understand why the US is in a tense relationship with Iran and has been for a long time, you can look up the history there. You can get the reason why. If you want to know why there is why there has been a rise in people who don't think that vaccines should be taken, you can look that up. You can try to educate yourself on these things. If you want to know more about what what tariffs are, or you want to know more about the influence of immigration in this country. These are all things you can look up like never before. You used to have to go to a library and the number of sources was limited. Now, all those sources are out there. You can get them. You can get the information about the candidates. You can both get what they tell you about themselves, but also because so much information is out there, you can get information about what they've actually done. If they tell you something like, I represent everybody, I care about people of all colors, and then you look at their history and see that no, they've actually voted for a lot of racist sorts of legislation, then you can know that they're lying to you. It's much easier to hold them accountable and get that information. Are there any other good ones people want to bring up? Because I think there are a lot of good things about technology and its influence on democracy. What then are, let's talk about the neutral ones. What I want to talk about is what these neutral ones are things that by themselves don't really have good or bad, but have changed the way the country looks and have changed how politics happen. So for instance, we now vote on machines a lot of the time. We now vote by going to, not every state does this, but I know in New York, it's always, there's a little machine that like counts your paper ballot. Other places you press a button. So what is the significance of this? Matthew, what do you mean by lead to a greater divide? Do you mean like in terms of the things we were talking about last time with views or access to technology? Because I think you're right that there is something with a greater divide, but what divide? Social media and views. So we'll put up polarization and extremism on the rise. So we now often have voting using machines. What's the significance of voting on machines? Is there one, or is it just different? Or what are the potential benefits, potential worries? So one benefit here with the good is we now find out much more quickly who's going to win, except for this past election where everything was paper. What this past election kind of showed us is how elections used to go. We used to have to wait days to find out who was going to win. These days, it's so quick, in large part because the machines are doing the counting. So that's a positive. It's faster. We find out sooner. They're also, they're more accurate. There are certain things machines are very good at, and including them are things like counting. Are people familiar with what happened in 2000 in Florida in the George W. Bush versus Al Gore election, and what the phrase hanging Chad meant?
Wasn't it basically like stealing or like using dead people's or recently deceased people's like votes because they're
that was a different issue. There was an issue of whether this sort of fraud was happening, but the hanging Chad issue wasn't fraud. It was a literal physical issue. So here's the way that ballots used to work in a lot of places. It was a piece of paper that looked like this. And each on the paper, instead of filling in a dot, there was a partially cut circle. So it would be like this, candidate, or in this case, it was Bush. And you had this little circle on the piece of paper that was partially but not completely cut out, Gore. And what you do is you take basically a little metal pin and you poke the piece of paper that you wanted to vote for. And then this circle would then become a hole, and the machine would read that hole. The issue was that, so you've all taken standardized tests, and the idea is the machine only reads the piece of paper if the bubble's filled in all the way. Well, what you can imagine is, this is looking at the paper from the top. What was happening with a lot of these things was, well, if you looked from the side and you saw which hole was punched, the piece of paper didn't come all the way off. So if we're looking at a piece of paper from the side like this, you can imagine that the hole didn't go all the way through and there was still a piece of paper hanging there. So from the side view, it would look like this. So there was this question of, does that count as a vote or not? Does it count as a vote if the piece of paper was not fully punched all the way through? And this led to a big Supreme Court issue, and nobody knew how to describe it. These sorts of problems don't come up with modern technology. You don't have to literally worry about people punching holes in pieces of paper. Instead, the machine's much more accurate. You fill in the bubble, it reads it. You press a button, it works. All of this sort of thing goes, if it's going well, it goes very well. Of course, what can be the problem? What is the issue with using machines? Yes, these
Botting.
things can be more accurate, but Marcus.
Things like botting, where you just have people create programs and anonymously vote, and like you can't tell if it's real or fake until like you actually like go really deep, and sometimes you can't even tell.
Yeah, in theory, a computerized voting system could, in theory, be hacked. That is one major issue with it. Another thing is there are problems with things like, technology can go wrong. There was an issue a couple of years ago in New York City where it was a rainy day, and when the ballots got wet, the machines got clogged. And so there was an issue of, is my ballot actually going to get read? Or is the technology actually, when things go wrong, going to lead to bigger problems? So on the way you can think of it is, at its best, technological voting works better than non, but at its worst, it's way worse than just having someone count pieces of paper. What is the influence of the fact that people can now donate online? This, I think, is a much bigger issue and has changed politics a lot more than people often realize. What is the fact that we can donate online? Why is that significant?
Like, you mean donate to politicians and stuff?
Yes.
Or
Yeah, you donate to a politician's campaign online. You used to have to mail a check or give them money at the little place. Now you can go online. Why is that difference significant? What has it changed about politics? I'm going to put up 3 letters, and I'm going to ask you all to see if you can draw the connections. Why am I writing AOC on here? Anyone see the connection here between paying online and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? Anyone see any connection here? There is one, I can explain. I just want to see if anyone can get to it. All right, so those of you, who is AOC?
isn't she like a Democratic representative? But I think she's counted. I don't know if the people said she was progressive Democrat.
She's an extremely progressive Democrat from the 14th district up in the Bronx. Anyone know how old she is?
I think she's pretty young.
Yeah, she's like
20
30.
something, 30,
she's
yeah.
very, very young for a politician. She got into office the first time, I think she was 26, 27. She was a young woman who just had a bachelor's. She's 31 now. Yeah, so she's a very young politician with very progressive views. She's also Latina, which is, again, not something that you don't think of young Latino women as somebody who is going to be in politics. Go back through history of the United States and you will find very, very, very few young Latina women in politics. What was it that changed? Why is it that she's now able to? Well, go back 50 years. The only people who could take the time and effort to donate to a campaign and to get their views heard were people who had, so the only people who could really get money to a campaign so that campaign would hear them were going to be people with large amounts of money, because it took a lot of effort to donate. Nowadays, you can go online and donate $20 to your preferred candidate, and it's worth it because it takes you 3 minutes to donate. All you have to do, go online, donate, done. So what the fact that people are able to donate online means is a lot of less wealthy people are donating for the first time and donating small amounts of money because it's so easy to do so. Back in the day, it was much harder. It wasn't worth your time and effort to give $10 to a candidate because you'd have to go somewhere, write a check, figure it all out, fill out some paperwork. Now you go online. So somebody like Bernie Sanders, most of his campaign finance comes from small donors. It doesn't come from, getting $10 million from Chase Bank. It instead comes from getting $10 from a million different small people. So this has led to things in which candidates who in the past would never have gotten anywhere close to getting elected are getting elected. So part of the reason that you are seeing candidates that are more progressive than in the past is because of the fact that campaign donations have changed. And also because people are able to reach their constituents directly. She was able to campaign, and the person who she won the Democratic primary from was a many-term Democratic congressman who had a lot of money behind him from bigger businesses, and the Democratic National Committee was behind him. She was able to overthrow this guy because of the donations of small people and the fact she got directly in touch with her constituents. On the flip side, this same thing is what has allowed people with more extreme right-wing views to also get elected. So people on the extremes, you can think whatever, one consequence of this change in donations is that we now are having representatives from more extreme left and right views within politics. You can get people elected who believe in more liberal positions than people did 20 years ago, and people who feel much more conservative than politicians were 20 years ago. You can have people getting elected who believe in QAnon. You can have people getting elected who believe in a minimum salary for everybody. Neither of those positions ever would have gotten any voters or any Congress people who held those positions. None of them would have been elected in the past. They're now able to in part because of these donations. Another thing that candidates are able to do is data mine. Companies aren't the only ones data mining. And again, what was data mining? Reminder, somebody tell me, what is it to mine data, or what is data mining? This goes back to our privacy unit. What was data mining?
Basically like using algorithms by they collect the data and used algorithms to like force people to see stuff depending on like what
it's about mining. It's about looking at large sets of data to find out key points. So what candidates are now able to do is by looking at past elections, looking at various socioeconomic factors and things like that, they can predict voter behaviors much more than ever before. They're able to predict where they should spend their time campaigning. They can predict which groups of people are going to vote for them, what sorts of issues matter to those people. So there's a way in which candidates can associate or can cater their own campaign to what people want and what people need. All right, so those are the neutral and the goods. Let's talk bads. Let's talk about the ways in which democracy has been hurt by modern technology. And I think there's a genuine question of which of these two sides weighs more. I think there's a genuine question to be had of whether technology has done more to help our democracy or hurt our democracy. So first off, how has technology changed our relationship to misinformation and rumors? What is it about modern technology that means that we're talking about these misinformations and rumors? Because we've always had rumors, we've always had misinformation in this country. What is it though that modern technology has changed? Why is this up here under the bad section for modern technology and democracy?
It allows us to see many different views very fast, and like you can tell because there's going to be different people writing it.
So this is true. You can see many more views than ever before, because what's the difference between a Facebook story or a blog and a news station? If you want to write something for the New York Times, what do you have to do?
Be qualified.
Yeah, you have to go through years of training, and then there are people there who check to make sure what you're saying is true. If you want to start a blog, what do you have to do?
Just make an account.
Yeah, you make an account and sign up. Why does this matter? Well, because if you look at a website, there's no necessary way you can tell just by looking at it whether the person who wrote this is just a blogger or is somebody who, is a journalist who has done this for years and there's actually a system in place to make sure they're not making stuff up. On 4chan, you can say whatever you want. On Reddit, you can say whatever you want. You're anonymous. But then when somebody just says, oh, I read online that blah, 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 nobody's double checking where they got their source. And most people, if they see it on something like Facebook, they're just going to assume it's the same sort of thing as any other news story. Because on your Facebook account, if you open Facebook, marker's starting to go. If you open Facebook and here's like your news feed, you'll see like NYT, blah, blah. And then you see like 1000. This can be some made up news site, or this can be David Neely's blog, yada, yada. So if you're somebody who doesn't really pause and think about it or look and necessarily see, you just see yada, yada, and blah, blah, blah on your news feed. And if you're the average person, you're like, oh, those are equally reputable. This is news. I read on Facebook that this is the case, with no thought of whether or not these are the same thing. So to get into a newspaper, you have to cross a certain threshold to count as to be allowed to print your story. But most people these days get their news from Facebook or from Google. And the fact is that these news stories don't have to, in a lot of cases, pass this bar of like truthfulness, which means that a lot of misinformation is able to be spread. And what's the problem with misinformation? Why is it a problem that misinformation is out there and being spread by modern technology? What does it threaten? Who is affected by this?
Mostly voters,
Yeah.
politicians, and a lot of safety sometimes.
Yeah, the main issue is over here we had it educates voters. That's one of the things we like about democracy. And we said before, for democracy to run well, you need an educated population. We can't have 4-year-olds voting. But if misinformation is mixed in amongst the real information and the average person isn't telling the difference, while it is true that people can become more educated, it becomes the case that people, as a matter of fact, become less educated. Because while yes, if you put in the time and effort to get your information online correctly and you double check your sources, you will be much more educated than anyone has ever been before on politics. The downside is the person who doesn't put in effort, doesn't try to find this out, is going to be less informed, or at least more misinformed than ever before. There are going to be people who believe conspiracy theories. There are going to be people who read things. And so as a matter of fact, while we do have more educated, some people more educated than ever before, we also have less people who understand what's going on than ever before in a lot of ways. And filtering into this is the echo chamber effect. So remember what I talked about last time with Facebook and the Facebook algorithms, and how what news stories you see are affected by what you've heard before, and the way in which something like Google is going to give you suggestions based on what your past views are. Well, this is going to, what it's going to lead to is the population is no longer going to have a set of agreed upon information. It's no longer going to be the case that everyone's coming from the same position and everyone is agreeing on certain types of facts about the matter and then disagreeing about what we should do about them. Now, because information is so rampant, it is possible to have different groups of people who can't even talk to each other because they can't even agree on how many people are coming into the country, or what the people coming into the country are doing, or why there are fewer jobs in certain places. If people are disagreeing about these fundamental facts, there can't be agreement about what to do with them, and the democracy is unable to function in the way it's supposed to. So does everyone understand that key point of, while yes, we can get more information if we want, it's also much easier to stay within your own echo chamber and only get information that supports your own views, can lead to misinformation, and can lead to a politics that, instead of looking at facts, is much more based on emotion and less on understanding. So does this make sense to everyone, how this sort of thing can work?
Yep.
All right. ignoring the tech lists. I think this is another thing that is happening, is that people who aren't associated or aren't familiar with technology, generally older people or less wealthy people, are not fully able to engage in these sorts of ways like other people can. So while yes, people can talk more directly and certain minority groups are being heard more, other groups are not being heard as much. People who don't understand how technology works are less able to interact with their politicians. And then polarization and extremism are going up. And I think there's a few different factors for this. One of these is the echo chamber filtering effect. But what are some other ways in which polarization and extremism, how is it that the internet has led to these things? And this is tying back in with what we talked about last time. Why is it that extreme views in politics are going up? And, or more accurately, how has the internet led to this?
People just like group up, like they're able to group masses of people, and like people tend to just stay with their own, so
Yeah,
it goes really high.
because of what we talked about last week with community, groups of people are able to collectively gather together and talk with each other and get more and more extreme views. These are the ways in which, so what we have, and extreme views generally aren't good for a democracy. And yeah, misinformation drives a lot of that as well. So it's this kind of, self-fulfilling prophecy where extremism, people collect together and become more extreme. Those extreme people start being self-selected either through their filters online or through the news stories they choose to look at, start getting more misinformation. This misinformation then goes to new people to then who themselves, new folks, who then become more extreme, and it just creates more. The extreme people create the misinformation, which leads to more new people becoming extreme, and the extreme people who get the misinformation becoming more extreme. So another thing about technology that's bad, and because the sources aren't always clear, it can create this strange thing of this illusion of factual background when it isn't actually the case. So here was the fascinating thing with, to use the previous election and Trump's claims of voter fraud or of election fraud. The way this got off the ground was basically, here's what happens. Start number one. Trump says election fraud. This then makes it to the Twitter sphere. And on Twitter, people say there must be election fraud. Trump is talking about it. Then what happens is Trump, reading on Twitter, sees people talking about the election fraud and concludes there must be election fraud. People are talking about it. So what you have is this case in which somebody says there's been election fraud, which then makes it online where people just hear this and it gets talked about. And then because so many people are talking about it, it gets to be trending, which leads to somebody else having this conclusion, well, if everybody's talking about it, it must be the case. And so this sort of thing, where the way in which what their own views or what they say can become so discussed that it can seem like it is factual. Because very often, if everyone believes a thing, we think it's true. And this is how something like QAnon got off the ground. A conspiracy theory gets more popular when more and more people believe it. So if somebody says something and then just people start talking about it, everyone else is going to be like, well, it's getting talked about online. And because we don't know the source and don't take the time to look for it, if so many people are talking about it, we generally assume, well, they must have some knowledge to back this up. So in this way, the misinformation is able to spread like never before. Another thing that is able to happen is So we talked a few weeks back about the ways in which, another thing, Howard says tech can group people by psychological characteristics. And that goes back to the data mining thing. So what propaganda / influence, actually, one thing that this has allowed people to do is technology, you're able to see what people's interests are online and then try to mobilize those people. So for instance, if you see, because Facebook sells its user data, so if you're liking a whole lot of things that suggest that you're, say, progressive and that you have progressive views, candidates are going to be able to know this and then cater their advertising to what they know is most important to you. And that can have both a good side and a bad side. And the bad side can be things like they will ignore the things that they do which you wouldn't like and only play up the things you do like. And part of that is based off of your psychological characteristics. If they see how you behave online, they can give you ads based on that. If they know that you like brazen headlines and you're always posting things like breaking news, then they'll give you an ad that looks like that. But now, here's the last thing I want to talk about is, and this goes back to something we talked about a few times ago, where the nature of war and interaction between nations has changed. So I talked about how countries are now constantly trying to hack each other and influence each other in these sorts of ways. It's no longer the case that to commit some sort of sabotage, you have to have troops on the ground. You can now do it digitally. You can shut down things. Well, another thing that this has allowed nations to do is to conduct propaganda campaigns on other nations using things like Facebook and using things like other types of social media. So to give a clear example of this, let's talk about, it was a hot button topic at the time, and there were a lot of things that were said about Trump and the 2016 election and Russian election tampering and these sorts of things, which weren't true. And the way that it got discussed in the media and the way in which it was talked about made it seem like, in a lot of ways, Trump was actively working with the Russian government to affect our election. And it seems like after the findings, that wasn't the case. But there was nonetheless cases in which Russia was directly influencing our governments or our election, not by changing, not the machines, not by tampering with anything in that way, but by actively doing things to influence voters. And this is something which has never before been possible to the same degree without having people actually there. So it's possible for one nation to force another nation to have its views if you send an army there and force them to vote the way you want them to. But it's now possible to influence voters based on or using Facebook and by sending them things like fake news. So in the 2016 election, there was a government branch within the Russian government that basically hired a bunch of young 20s computer programmers to create fake Facebook accounts and generate fake news stories and then start pumping them into Facebook so that they'd start being shared and prime this misinformation. And they would do things like create fake Facebook groups. And so there was one instance in which they literally started, hackers from Russia were able to almost start a riot in Texas. And the way that this happened was basically they were just trying to cause chaos within the United States. And what this group of Russian hackers did is they went on Facebook, created a fake Facebook profile, and started a group called like the Islamic, what was it? Like the Islamic Cultural Society of Texas. I don't think that was the actual name, but it was something like this. And then on the other side, they had, so that was one group. And so this group they started, and what they did is they made a bunch of fake profiles, started this, and set up an event in Texas to have this group come together for like a cultural day. They also, however, same group of hackers set up another group with a bunch of fake people in it who set up a group called something along the lines of like the Texans for Freedom. And they had a day planned called the Stop the Islamicization of Texas. So both of these groups were started by a group of hackers in Russia. And they were posted and they created these events of they started these events with on the ground like meetups, only they set them up to occur on the same street at the same time on the same day. And once these groups were created, large numbers of actual people started joining up. So you had people going and attending these rallies that were, oh, it's a little blurry. Has it unblurred, Howard? Here, give me one sec. All right, is it? Yeah. All right, so what you had was this group of people that were originally just a bunch of Russian hackers, then joined by a lot of actual Americans, a different group of Russian hackers who were then joined by a bunch of Americans. And what they caused to happen were two groups of people gathering on an actual street in Texas where they had to be separated by police. And this was done entirely by a Russian government organization, the goal being to cause people to get unhappy. Another thing that happened was there were Russian government organizations who paid people to do things. They set up, in this case, the Russian government wanted Trump to win the election, so they started pro-Trump groups and financed them from Russia. So there was one case in which there was a big pro-Trump rally in Florida in which somebody dressed as Hillary Clinton was put in a fake jail cell with a sign, "Lock her up." Turned out that actor was paid from Moscow. These are all cases in which the US elections are being affected by a government halfway around the world operating with its own interests in mind. And this is something that has never before been able to be done. We have not in the same way. We've always been countries always try to operate using propaganda, but has never before been able to be as successful because the technology needed to do these sorts of things has only come into existence now. And this is kind of the downside. The same things that allow minority voices to be heard also allow this sort of manipulation in which people are able to manipulate people on Facebook towards ends that are not in those people's best interests, but are rather being dictated by somebody halfway around the world with completely different interests. So does everyone understand generally how this worked? By just creating these Facebook groups, getting it up, making it look real. Because of the anonymity online, people from elsewhere with different interests in the United States are able to, in some sense, affect the US government elections in a way that, on a scale that has never happened before. And these things are just going to keep going up more and more and more as technology spreads more and more widely. Any last points anyone wants to throw in here? Any last things that people want to discuss? Oh, one other thing I want to talk about as a bad. And this is something we've talked about all semester, which is that new technology is making legislative vacuums. That says vacuums. I don't know how to spell vacuum, so there's a bunch of fake letters in there. Oh, Howard says internet bots play a big role. Yeah, internet bots are another thing that can greatly influence this. So an internet bot, you just program something to do something like a particular person. And once the number of likes go up, you start trending or you start appearing. So these Russian hackers were able to not just create fake accounts. These fake accounts were designed as bots that would then respond and make it look like there was more engagement. So what would often happen is you'd have people, you'd make a bot account, send it into a group of people, and have it start saying extreme views, with the hope then being that this bot would cause even more group polarization within the group. So not just actual people saying more and more extreme things, you just drop in some fake person, have that person say extreme things, and they'll start to cause the actual human beings in this Facebook group to get more extreme as well. New technology is also creating these legislative vacuums. And this is what we've talked about all semester. The Democratic government cannot keep up with the new technology. So we have all these technologies like Facebook that are being more or less unregulated. And that can lead to problems because we then have new types of technology where the laws around them are not really needed to control what is happening. Part of the reason that Facebook is able to affect elections in the way it is and the way it's able to get exploited is because there's no laws preventing Facebook from posting news stories in this way, because it's been around for 10 years and the government wasn't able to get out in front of these issues and actually like legislate about them. It's only now that big tech companies are being brought in, but in front of Congress to answer questions about like the ways in which they fact check and things like this and the impact they have. So because of how long it takes for anything to get done, we now have all these issues where the technologies are not being governed by law, and it's leading to a lot of exploitation in politics. And people are able to get away with things or do things or influence elections in ways that they never could before, and there's no laws in place to prevent it from happening. All right, I've got nothing more I want to say today. Does anyone have anything they want to add on this? For those of you who came late, I'm going to be sending out the readings for next week, probably either later today or tomorrow. It won't be much. And what we're going to be talking about next time is basically like personhood. What is it to be a person in the context of the internet? And then also some stuff about AI, artificial intelligence. And I mean like the robot type. So it'll be a little bit more philosophical of what is it to be a person? Does the internet change our understanding of what it is to be a person, etc.? All right, if no one else has any more questions, I'm gonna stop the recording and send you all on your way to go have a lovely weekend. I will see you